Death at the Graduation Party, a Velvet Clues original mystery, narrated by Connor. Welcome to Velvet Clues, I'm Connor, and tonight we're settling in with a fresh pot of tea and an absolutely captivating mystery, narrated from the perspective of Miss Jane Marple. If you've never encountered our beloved detective before, do listen closely. She has a remarkable ability to see what others miss, to understand human nature through the lens of village life and the quiet observation of ordinary people. Tonight's tale unfolds in the charming town of St. Cuthbert's, where a high school graduation celebration becomes the scene of a most troubling death. I do hope you'll join us for this journey through deception, ambition, and the terrible consequences of unchecked pride. Now, do get comfortable. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Valedictorian's Final Toast. The gymnasium of St. Cuthbert's High School had been transformed into something approaching elegance, though Miss Jane Marple, surveying the scene from her discreet position near the refreshment table, observed that the decorations possessed all the charm of something hastily assembled from construction paper and good intentions. Gold and blue streamers hung from the rafters in somewhat chaotic abundance, and the banner proclaiming Graduating Class of 2024 displayed a spelling error that would have horrified the English department. Still, the students seemed genuinely pleased with their efforts, and there was an undeniable energy to the occasion that reminded Miss Marple why she had accepted the invitation to attend. Her great-nephew Peter attended St. Cuthbert's, and his mother had insisted that Miss Marple's presence would represent the family's recognition of his achievement. Peter himself stood near the gymnasium's far end, engaged in animated conversation with several classmates, his youthful face alight with the particular joy that comes from recognizing that one chapter of life has conclusively ended and another, entirely unknown chapter awaits. The gymnasium was crowded with graduating seniors, their families, and faculty members who had been invited to celebrate the students' accomplishments. Long tables laden with food and beverages lined one wall, presided over by several parents who seemed to be taking their refreshment responsibilities with commendable seriousness. It was toward the punch bowl that Miss Marple's attention was drawn quite naturally, partly because it occupied the most prominent position, and partly because she had observed throughout her many years in St. Mary Mead that punch bowls at celebrations often contained far more mystery than one might initially suppose. The punch itself appeared innocent enough, a pleasing shade of pink that suggested the addition of fruit juices and perhaps some sort of sparkling water. A silver ladle rested at its side, and beside the bowl sat a stack of paper cups, in quantities that seemed to Miss Marple rather excessive. She was examining this arrangement with mild interest when a tap on her shoulder drew her attention to the approach of the school's headmaster, Mr. Gerald Thornton, a man of perhaps 60 years with the measured bearing that long association with the academic world tends to produce. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, taking her hand. "What a pleasure to see you here. I do hope you're enjoying yourself." "Quite pleasant indeed," she replied, adjusting her handbag and offering him a gentle smile. "The students have clearly put considerable effort into this occasion." "Yes, well, they have indeed, though I confess to some relief that the graduation ceremony itself passed without incident. With such large gatherings, one never quite knows what complications might arise." He paused, his expression growing slightly more serious. "I suppose you've heard about the grading controversy that surfaced just last month?" "A most distressing business. The school conducted an audit of our records and discovered that someone had been manipulating student grades in our system. Quite a sophisticated operation, actually. We still don't entirely understand how it was accomplished, though our IT director eventually traced the irregularities back to unauthorized access to the main administrative database. Most troubling indeed, Miss Marple observed, though such things did seem to happen with increasing frequency in the modern world. "Have you determined the source of this breach?" "We suspect it may have been one of our student technicians who works in the administrative office," Mr. Thornton replied, lowering his voice slightly. "The evidence isn't entirely conclusive, however, and the student in question denies the allegations most strenuously. The matter remains under investigation, though given that graduation has now taken place, any formal disciplinary action would have to be handled carefully. But here," he continued, brightening somewhat artificially, "I don't mean to burden you with administrative concerns on such a festive evening. I see our valedictorian is about to make his remarks. You must hear him speak. He's a truly exceptional young man, whatever the grading irregularities may suggest." Miss Marple followed the direction of Mr. Thornton's gaze to observe a tall, dark-haired young man of perhaps 18 years making his way toward the microphone that had been hastily erected beside the gymnasium's trophy case. This, she presumed, was Marcus Webb, the student whose academic achievements had earned him the designation of valedictorian, and whose name had been at the center of the recent grading controversy. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention, and his face bore the satisfied expression of one who had successfully navigated the various challenges and competitions of secondary education. The gymnasium gradually quieted as Marcus approached the microphone, the conversations and murmurs fading into attentive silence. He tapped the microphone with a practiced gesture, producing a brief burst of feedback that caused several students in the front rows to wince. Then, with the ease of someone entirely comfortable with public speaking, he began his remarks. "Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Marcus Webb, your class valedictorian. Standing here tonight, looking out at all of you, I can't help but reflect on what it means to work hard, to apply yourself to your studies, and to emerge from your high school experience with the knowledge that you've given nothing but your absolute best." He paused, smiling with what struck Miss Marple as a degree of self-satisfaction that exceeded what the occasion seemed to warrant. Throughout our 4 years at St. Cuthbert's, we've been tested in countless ways. We've studied for examinations, completed projects, maintained our grade point averages, and those of us who have applied ourselves most diligently have been rewarded with the academic recognition that we have earned through our dedication and discipline. Miss Marple found herself observing the reactions of the other students as Marcus spoke. Scattered throughout the gymnasium were young people whose faces bore expressions ranging from genuine admiration to something that appeared rather closer to resentment. One boy in particular, a sturdily built young man with red hair and an angry flush creeping up his neck, seemed to be listening with an intensity that suggested Marcus's words held some particular significance for him. Miss Marple filed this observation away, as she had learned to do throughout her many years of village life. Human nature, she had discovered, often displayed itself most clearly in the small, unguarded moments when people forgot to monitor their expressions. Marcus continued his remarks for several more minutes, emphasizing themes of academic excellence, personal responsibility, and the importance of maintaining the highest ethical standards in all endeavors. These pronouncements struck Miss Marple as containing a certain irony, given what she had just learned about the grading irregularities. When he finally concluded his remarks by raising a glass of punch and a toast to the graduating class, the applause that followed seemed genuine enough, though perhaps not quite as enthusiastic as such occasions might typically inspire. The speech concluded, the gymnasium settled back into the comfortable chaos of a social gathering. Parents and students mingled, photographs were taken, and the refreshment table once again became the center of attention. It was at this juncture that Mr. Thornton excused himself to attend to some administrative matter, leaving Miss Marple to her observations of the proceedings. She found herself making her way toward the punch bowl, ostensibly to obtain a beverage, but in reality, responding to that curious instinct that had guided her through decades of village mysteries. The woman supervising the refreshment table was Mrs. Catherine Wilson, one of the school's guidance counselors, a pleasant-faced woman of perhaps 50 years, with the competent bearing of someone accustomed to managing details. Miss Marple smiled at her warmly as she accepted a cup of punch. "You've done a lovely job with the refreshments, Mrs. Wilson. Everything appears most appetizing." "Thank you so much, Miss Marple," Mrs. Wilson replied, "though I confess I can't take much credit. Several of the parent volunteers contributed items from home, and a local caterer provided the main dishes. I've mostly just been keeping an eye on things and ensuring that everyone has adequate supplies." "A sensible approach," Miss Marple observed, taking a careful sip of her punch. "The flavour is quite pleasant. Fruit juice, I imagine, and something sparkling. Ginger ale, actually, and a mixture of fresh fruit juices. We were careful to avoid anything with alcohol, of course, given the youth of the celebrants. The only concern I had was that one of the parent volunteers mentioned they couldn't find their ladle after they helped refill the bowl earlier, but I simply used the spare, and thought no more of it. Miss Marple felt a small flutter of attention, that peculiar alertness that had served her so well over the years. A missing ladle seemed an insignificant matter, yet she had learned that such details often possessed more significance than they appeared to suggest. "I see," she murmured thoughtfully. "When was this ladle discovered to be missing?" "Oh, perhaps 30 or 40 minutes ago," Mrs. Wilson replied. "Just before the valedictorian speech, actually. The parent who mentioned it seemed to think she had left it here while she was helping to refill the punch bowl, but it had disappeared. I assured her not to worry, that there was likely a simple explanation, and she accepted my reassurance without further complaint. After all, these events are always rather chaotic, and things do go missing." "Quite true," Miss Marple agreed, though she continued to regard the punch bowl with an expression of mild contemplation. "Nonetheless, it's curious that the ladle should disappear so entirely. One might have thought someone would have noticed its removal." The evening proceeded with the pleasant unremarkableness of a school social gathering. Music played from a speaker system, students engaged in the photographs and conversations that such occasions inevitably generated, and parents circulated throughout the gymnasium offering congratulations and encouragement to the graduates. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings while remaining unobtrusive, a talent she had cultivated over many decades. She noted the continued hostile attention that the red-haired boy directed toward Marcus Webb whenever he believed himself unobserved. She observed the various clusters of students and their complex social dynamics. And she maintained a subtle awareness of the punch bowl, noting with interest the frequency with which various individuals approached it to obtain beverages. It was perhaps an hour after Marcus's speech that the first indication of trouble became apparent. A girl standing near the gymnasium's east wall suddenly cried out and pointed toward Marcus Webb, who had collapsed onto the floor in what appeared to be some sort of convulsive episode. Shouts erupted throughout the gymnasium as various people rushed toward the stricken student. Several faculty members pushed through the crowd, and Mr. Thornton's voice could be heard calling for someone to contact emergency services immediately. Miss Marple set down her untouched cup of punch and moved with deliberate calm toward the scene of the commotion. By the time she had navigated through the gathering crowd, she found that one of the school's teachers, a man named Robert Chen who taught mathematics and held a first aid certification, was already attempting to assess Marcus's condition. The boy was breathing in shallow, gasping breaths, and his skin had taken on an alarming pallor that suggested something considerably more serious than simple intoxication or food poisoning. The ambulance arrived with commendable speed, the paramedics conducting their own rapid assessment before beginning the careful work of placing Marcus onto a gurney and transporting him from the gymnasium. As they carried him toward their vehicle, one of the paramedics spoke briefly with Mr. Thornton, his expression grave. The headmaster's face grew increasingly pale as he listened to whatever explanation the paramedic offered. Miss Marple observed this exchange with deep concern, though she remained sufficiently distant to avoid drawing attention to herself. When Mr. Thornton turned to face the assembled students and parents, his expression conveyed news of the most troubling nature. "Everyone, please remain calm," he announced, raising his hands for quiet. "We've just been informed by the paramedics that Marcus Webb has apparently experienced some sort of acute poisoning episode. He's being transported to the hospital now, and we must all hope for his swift recovery. However, under these circumstances, this celebration must conclude. Parents are asked to collect their children and return home. School officials will be in contact with students and families as soon as we have further information." The gymnasium erupted into shocked conversation. Parents began gathering their children. Students clustered in small, anxious groups, and the festive atmosphere that had prevailed only moments before transformed into something approaching panic and confusion. It was amid this chaos that Miss Marple found her way to a quiet corner of the gymnasium, where she stood with her hands folded before her, her expression thoughtful and deeply concerned. She had observed something during the evening that had troubled her even before Marcus's collapse. She had noticed the red-haired boy slip something into the punch bowl while everyone's attention was focused on Marcus's speech, and she had observed, with particular clarity, the expression of grim satisfaction that had crossed his face immediately thereafter. Whatever had caused Marcus Webb's acute poisoning, Miss Marple was becoming increasingly certain that it had not been accidental, and that the young man's collapse signaled the beginning of an investigation that would uncover secrets far deeper than a mere case of deliberate contamination. Chapter 2. Poison in the Gymnasium. The arrival of Detective Inspector William Morrison at St. Cuthbert's High School marked the official transition from what had been an unfortunate accident into what the police department now treated as a potential criminal investigation. Inspector Morrison was a man of perhaps 55 years, with the careful bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex intersection of law enforcement and human nature. His sharp eyes took in every detail of the gymnasium scene as he conferred with Mr. Thornton and several uniformed officers who had arrived to establish a perimeter around the punch bowl. Miss Marple remained in her position near the gymnasium's east wall, observing the proceedings with the quiet attentiveness that had served her so well throughout her years as an observer of human behaviour. She had learned long ago that official investigations, while necessary and important, often overlook the very details that proved most significant. Police officers and detectives, for all their training and experience, sometimes brought expectations to a scene that prevented them from seeing what was actually present before them. It was while she was contemplating these matters that one of the uniformed officers approached her with a respectful demeanour. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" the officer asked. "Inspector Morrison would like to speak with you, if you have a few moments." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, gathering her handbag and allowing herself to be led across the gymnasium to where Inspector Morrison stood, already deep in discussion with Mr. Thornton and a young man in a white shirt whom Miss Marple recognised as Dr. Stephen Blake, the school's primary on-campus medical advisor. Inspector Morrison turned to regard Miss Marple with the sort of professional courtesy that suggested he considered her presence at the scene both noteworthy and potentially significant. "Miss Marple," the inspector said, acknowledging her with a slight nod, "I understand you were present throughout this evening's celebration. I wonder whether you might have observed anything unusual regarding the punch bowl or the refreshment table." "I did notice several small details that struck me as rather odd," Miss Marple replied carefully, her voice carrying the gentle precision that long experience had cultivated. First, Mrs. Wilson, who was supervising the refreshments, mentioned that a ladle disappeared from beside the punch bowl perhaps 40 minutes before the valedictorian's speech. Secondly, I observed a young man, sturdily built with reddish hair, approach the punch bowl during the speech and appear to place something into it. At the time, I was uncertain whether this observation possessed any significance, but given what has subsequently occurred, I think it may warrant investigation. Inspector Morrison's expression had sharpened considerably as Miss Marple spoke. "The description you provide of the red-haired boy," he said thoughtfully, "matches that of a student named Joshua Hartwell. Do you happen to know whether Joshua was known to associate with Marcus Webb, or whether there might have been any conflict between them?" "I'm afraid I have limited knowledge of the student body's social dynamics," Miss Marple replied. However, the intensity with which this young man watched Marcus during the speech suggested that there was some element of personal concern involved in his observation. One does not watch another person with such focused attention unless that other person holds some significance in one's emotional landscape. Dr. Blake stepped forward, his expression grave. "I've examined the punch bowl with preliminary chemical testing equipment, and I'm afraid my initial suspicion has been confirmed. There is definitely a toxic substance present in the punch. The specific compound will require laboratory analysis, but the early indicators suggest something potentially quite serious. The smell, when I tested the liquid, suggested the presence of methanol, which in sufficient quantities would cause precisely the sort of acute poisoning symptoms that Marcus exhibited." Inspector Morrison turned to address Mr. Thornton directly. "I'm going to need access to your student records, particularly information regarding Joshua Hartwell and Marcus Webb. Additionally, I'll require a list of all students who may have had grievances or conflicts with the valedictorian. Finally, I want this gymnasium sealed. As a crime scene, nothing is to be disturbed until my forensic team has completed their documentation." Mr. Thornton nodded, his earlier composure replaced by the pale anxiety of someone confronted with circumstances beyond his usual experience. "Of course, Inspector. Joshua's file is quite extensive, actually. He's been a student here for all 4 years, though his academic performance has been decidedly inconsistent. Particularly troubling was an incident that occurred just last month, when Joshua's grades were altered downward in several subjects, apparently by the same individual who made the unauthorized changes to other student records. Joshua contested these alterations, but the investigation was inconclusive. The incident may have affected his college prospects. Inspector Morrison's eyes had narrowed at this revelation. Grades altered downward, you say? And who was responsible for these alterations? Well, that's precisely the difficulty, Mr. Thornton explained. The investigation traced the unauthorized access back to the administrative computer system, but we couldn't definitively establish which student or faculty member had gained unauthorized access. However, given that Marcus Webb has particular technical expertise, and given the pattern of grade modifications, many within the school community have suspected that Marcus was responsible, though he has steadfastly denied the allegations. Miss Marple found herself contemplating the emerging pattern with the sort of quiet intensity that had always characterized her approach to complex human puzzles. A student whose grades had been deliberately lowered by someone in a position of technical authority. That same student's college prospects damaged as a result. And that same student now observed making what appeared to be a deliberate poisoning of a beverage consumed by the student he reasonably suspected of being responsible for his academic and collegiate injuries. The emotional logic of such actions was, Miss Marple had to acknowledge, quite clear. "Inspector," she said gently, "I wonder whether you might inquire about Joshua Hartwell's college prospects, prior to and following the grading alterations. If my observations are correct, the change in his circumstances may prove quite significant to understanding his potential motivation." "An excellent suggestion," the inspector agreed. "Mr. Thornton, I'll need complete information on Joshua Hartwell's college applications and scholarship offers. Particularly, I need to know whether any scholarship offers were withdrawn following the grade changes. And I'll need to speak with Joshua immediately. Where might I find him?" "Joshua left the gymnasium with several other students shortly after Marcus collapsed," Mr. Thornton replied, consulting with one of the other administrators who had joined them. "However, I have his address on file, and I can provide that information immediately." As Mr. Thornton hurried off to retrieve the necessary records, Inspector Morrison turned his attention to the punch bowl itself, which now stood cordoned off with yellow police tape. Sergeant Patricia Williams, a competent forensic technician whom Miss Marple recognized from previous encounters in the village of St. Mary Mead, was already engaged in the careful documentation of the scene. "The original ladle that Mrs. Wilson mentioned," Miss Marple observed, "may prove significant. If the ladle was removed from the scene, that suggests the responsible party intended to eliminate evidence. The fact that they succeeded in removing it indicates planning and deliberation rather than impulsive action." "You're suggesting this was premeditated," Inspector Morrison said, acknowledging Miss Marple's conclusion with a slight nod. "Yes, I would agree. The choice to use a specific poison, the knowledge of how to access the punch bowl without drawing immediate attention, the removal of the ladle that might have revealed the presence of the toxic substance, all of these elements suggest careful planning rather than simple youthful revenge. This is considerably more serious than I initially feared." Within the next several hours, Joshua Hartwell was located at his family home and brought in for questioning. Miss Marple, after providing her formal statement to Inspector Morrison and receiving his assurance that she would be contacted if further information was required, returned to her residence in St. Mary Mead with Mrs. Bantry, who had accompanied her to the graduation celebration. During the drive back to the village, Mrs. Bantry's conversation continued to circle back to the troubling events of the evening. "Jane, my dear," she said with evident distress, "surely that poor boy Joshua couldn't have truly intended to murder Marcus. Perhaps the poison wasn't as serious as the doctors fear. Perhaps Marcus will make a complete recovery." Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully out toward the darkening landscape that passed by the automobile windows. "I fear that is an optimistic hope, my dear," she replied quietly. "Methanol is an extremely dangerous substance. In sufficient quantities, it can be quite quickly fatal. Whether Joshua Hartwell intended Marcus's death, or merely sought some form of harmful revenge, the consequences of his actions may prove to be far more serious than he anticipated, and that, I suspect, is precisely the tragedy that will emerge from this evening's events." Chapter 3. The Digital Deception Revealed. The morning following Marcus Webb's collapse brought with it the sort of grey autumn weather that seemed to match the mood of the St. Cuthbert's community, now struggling to comprehend what had occurred within their gymnasium. The local newspaper had obtained knowledge of the poisoning incident and had published a preliminary report that described the medical emergency without yet confirming the nature of the toxic substance or identifying the suspected perpetrator. Inspector Morrison, conducting his investigation with characteristic thoroughness, had made several important discoveries through his questioning of Joshua Hartwell and his examination of school records. Miss Marple, having maintained a friendly relationship with the local police force through years of providing useful observations and insights, found herself receiving a courtesy visit from Inspector Morrison at her residence in St. Mary Mead. He arrived mid-morning with a portfolio of documents and the weary expression of someone who had been working through the night examining evidence and conducting interviews. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, accepting the cup of tea she offered with evident gratitude. "I've come to discuss some of the findings that have emerged from my investigation. I believe your initial observations were quite perspicacious, though the situation has proven to be even more complex than I initially appreciated." "Please, do sit down and make yourself comfortable," Miss Marple replied, settling herself in her familiar chair near the fireplace. "I confess to considerable curiosity about the circumstances surrounding Joshua Hartwell and Marcus Webb. The grading alterations seem to be at the heart of this matter, though I suspect there may be additional elements that I have not yet understood." Inspector Morrison opened his portfolio and withdrew several documents that appeared to be school records and computer printouts. "According to my investigation, Joshua Hartwell was indeed a victim of deliberate grade manipulation. His grades in mathematics, chemistry, and English literature were all systematically lowered over a period of several weeks. These grade changes would have reduced his overall grade point average by approximately 0.3 points, which was sufficient to disqualify him from a prestigious science scholarship that he had been awarded by the state university system. And Marcus Webb was responsible for these alterations?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "The evidence strongly suggests it, yes. Marcus had obtained unauthorized access to the school's grading database through his work as a student technician in the administrative office. Our IT director conducted a thorough examination of the system logs and discovered that Marcus used his administrative credentials to make the alterations to Joshua's grades, as well as to alter the grades of at least 7 other students. In some cases, he lowered their grades, while in others he raised his own grades, or the grades of students he was friendly with." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft clink of china. A most troubling abuse of position and trust. "I imagine Joshua Hartwell discovered this manipulation of his academic record." "He did," the inspector confirmed. "Joshua noticed the grade changes relatively quickly, as the school generates automatic reports to students regarding any modifications to their academic records. He filed a formal complaint with the school administration about 3 weeks ago. An investigation was launched, but while the evidence pointed toward Marcus Webb, Marcus denied involvement, and the school was unable to definitively prove the unauthorized access. The school was preparing to escalate the investigation when Joshua's scholarship was ultimately withdrawn by the university because of the lowered grades, which they deemed disqualifying. "A consequence that appears to have motivated Joshua to take matters into his own hands," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Tell me, Inspector, what was the financial value of Joshua's scholarship?" "Approximately $28,000 per year for 4 years. A considerable sum that would have represented the difference between Joshua being able to attend university and his family being unable to afford the tuition. His family is not wealthy, and there are 3 other children who will eventually require university education. The scholarship was quite literally Joshua's pathway to a different life." Inspector Morrison withdrew another document from his portfolio. This is where the matter becomes even more complicated. The school's IT director, at my specific request, conducted a more thorough examination of the grading system than had previously been performed. In doing so, they discovered something quite remarkable. The initial unauthorized access and grade modifications were not actually performed by Marcus Webb. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, though she made no other indication of surprise. Then who was responsible for the original alterations? "That is precisely what I've been attempting to determine," the inspector replied. "The system logs show that the initial unauthorized access came from an administrative account belonging to Dr. Henry Sutton, the school's assistant principal. Sutton has been at the school for nearly 15 years and has access to all computer systems, all files, and all administrative functions. When I questioned him about the unauthorized access, he broke down almost immediately and confessed to the entire scheme." Miss Marple felt a deep sadness settle over her. A man of education and position, deliberately manipulating student records. What possible motivation could drive such actions? "Money," the inspector replied grimly. Dr. Sutton acknowledged that he had become involved in a personal financial difficulty. He had made some poor investments and had accumulated significant debt. Marcus Webb, who was aware of Dr. Sutton's situation through various conversations, approached the assistant principal and offered to pay him in exchange for specific grade manipulations. Marcus wanted his grades elevated, and the grades of certain competitors lowered to ensure his position as valedictorian would be secure. But surely Marcus could have achieved the valedictorian position through legitimate academic performance. Apparently, Marcus believed there was a risk that his achievements would not be sufficient to secure the position, the inspector explained. His actual grades were quite good, but he was concerned about losing to another student named Catherine Lynn, who was performing at a very similar level. By having Dr. Sutton lower Catherine's grades while raising his own, Marcus thought he could guarantee the valedictorian position. "The manipulation spiraled beyond his control," Miss Marple observed. "He altered Joshua Hartwell's grades, which triggered an investigation. He involved Dr. Sutton in criminal activity, which created a witness to his actions. And he demonstrated to other students through his actions that academic achievement could be obtained through corrupt means rather than legitimate effort." "Precisely," Inspector Morrison agreed. What Marcus apparently did not anticipate was that Joshua Hartwell would discover the manipulation, and that the discovery would be sufficiently traumatic to motivate him to commit what was essentially an act of revenge. Joshua purchased methanol through an online vendor who asked no questions about the intended use. He researched poisons online, apparently trying to determine the minimal amount required to cause harm without immediately killing the victim. He stole the ladle from the refreshment table during the chaos of the graduation ceremony and prepared to poison the punch. "And yet," Miss Marple said slowly, "I wonder whether Joshua truly understood the lethality of the substance he intended to use. Methanol's effects are not immediately obvious. One might cause considerable harm with the belief that it would result in temporary illness rather than permanent damage or death." "That is possibly true," the inspector acknowledged. Joshua, when questioned, expressed shock and horror at learning that Marcus had been transported to the hospital with what appeared to be a life-threatening poisoning. He claimed that his intention was only to cause Marcus to become ill enough to be unable to attend his college courses for several weeks, thereby giving Joshua time to contact the universities where Marcus had been accepted and inform them about the grade manipulation. It's a weak claim, given the lethality of methanol, but it may reflect Joshua's actual intent rather than an intentional premeditation of murder. "Has Marcus recovered?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. Inspector Morrison set down his teacup and met Miss Marple's eyes with an expression of genuine sadness. "Marcus Webb died this morning at the hospital," he said quietly. "The methanol poisoning caused acute organ failure. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, there was simply too much damage to his system to reverse. He was pronounced dead at 6:47 this morning." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the finality of this revelation. "2 lives destroyed," she said softly. "Marcus through his own corruption and ambition, and Joshua through his anger and desperation. And yet there are others whose lives will be permanently affected by this tragedy. Dr. Sutton's career has ended in disgrace. Catherine Lynn will carry forever the knowledge that the academic honours she may have received were denied her through deliberate corruption. And Joshua Hartwell, regardless of the legal outcome, will spend the remainder of his life aware that his actions resulted in another person's death." "The complexities of human nature never cease to amaze me," Miss Marple continued, opening her eyes and regarding Inspector Morrison with her characteristic gravity. A young man with every advantage, intelligence, opportunity, position, chose to abuse that position for the sake of absolute achievement. And another young man, who had done nothing wrong, allowed his legitimate grievance to drive him toward an act of violence that he may not have fully understood the consequences of committing. It is a tragedy of the most complete sort. Chapter 4. The Secondary Evidence. As the week following Marcus Webb's death progressed, Inspector Morrison's investigation expanded to encompass not only the immediate circumstances of the poisoning, but also the broader systems and decisions that had enabled the initial grade manipulation to go undetected for so long. Miss Marple, though not formally involved in the police investigation, found herself reflecting frequently on the events and their implications, and she was therefore quite pleased when Inspector Morrison appeared at her residence on Wednesday morning with a request for her observations on a particular aspect of the case. "Miss Marple," he began, settling himself in his familiar chair, "I find myself troubled by some inconsistencies in the timeline that I cannot entirely account for. I wonder whether I might present my findings to you and request your perspective on certain details that seem to resist my understanding." "Of course, Inspector. I'm always pleased to be of service, though I must caution that my observations are merely those of someone who has spent a lifetime noticing the small details of human behavior rather than conducting formal investigations." Inspector Morrison withdrew a detailed timeline that he had constructed through interviews with witnesses and examination of computer records. "This document," he explained, "represents my chronological reconstruction of events leading to Marcus Webb's death. The earliest entry is the initial unauthorized access to the grading system, which occurred approximately 6 weeks before the graduation ceremony. According to the computer logs, an administrator with Dr. Sutton's credentials accessed the grading database on the evening of April 19th and performed the first grade alterations to Joshua Hartwell's academic record. However, the second entry is where I find myself uncertain. The next documented unauthorized access didn't occur until 2 weeks later, on May 3rd. During that interval, Joshua Hartwell would have received his first notification of the grade changes through the school's automated student notification system. He would have immediately understood what had happened, and yet, according to my timeline, Joshua didn't file his formal complaint about the grade alterations until May 14th, which was an 11-day delay between discovering the alterations and taking action to report them. Miss Marple examined the timeline with careful attention, her eyes moving slowly over the listed dates and events. "That delay is significant," she observed. "Why would Joshua have waited 11 days before reporting the alterations?" "That is precisely what troubles me," the inspector replied. "I questioned Joshua extensively about this delay. He claims that he spent the 11 days attempting to determine the source of the alterations himself, reviewing the school's administrative procedures and examining computer security protocols. He says he wanted to gather additional evidence before filing his complaint, believing that more detailed information would strengthen his case. However, the school has no record of Joshua accessing the administrative system or engaging in any investigation of his own." "Then where did the delay originate?" Miss Marple asked. "If Joshua did not spend that time investigating, what did he do?" "That is the mystery that currently eludes me," Inspector Morrison replied with evident frustration. According to his parents, he seemed withdrawn and angry during that 11-day period. He spent considerable time in his bedroom and claimed to be researching material for a school project. Yet his teachers have no recollection of any assignment that would have required the research he claims to have been conducting. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the window, where she stood looking out onto the peaceful village street beyond. "Sometimes," she observed slowly, "individuals in distress engage in activities that they are reluctant to discuss, even with law enforcement officials. They may fear that their activities will be viewed as suspicious or will complicate their situation further. Tell me, Inspector, did Joshua have access to computer equipment during this 11-day period? Did he purchase anything unusual?" Inspector Morrison consulted his notes. "Yes, actually. I made inquiries with the local retailers, and Joshua purchased several items during that period. Most notably, he obtained a chemistry textbook from the local bookstore on May 7th. He also purchased a microscale chemistry kit from a scientific supply company. And according to his mother, He spent considerable time reading online material related to toxicology and poisons. When I questioned him about these activities, he initially claimed they were for a school assignment, but when pressed, he eventually admitted that he was researching poisons. And when did he decide to obtain the methanol? That's where the timeline becomes clearest, the inspector replied. According to the online vendors' records, Joshua placed his order for methanol on May 20th. It arrived at his residence on May 25th. Given that he filed his formal complaint about the grading on May 14th, this represents a 6-day gap between reporting the alterations and obtaining the poison. However, during this 6-day period, Joshua claims he believed that the school administration was not taking his complaint seriously. He had been told that the investigation would take time and that the matter would be difficult to resolve with certainty. Joshua interpreted this to mean that Marcus might escape punishment entirely, particularly given Marcus's consistent denial of responsibility. "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. So Joshua's progression was as follows. He discovered the alterations, spent 11 days investigating on his own, filed a formal complaint, was informed the process would be lengthy and uncertain, and then decided to take direct action by obtaining a poison and planning the poisoning at the graduation celebration. The question that troubles me is whether Joshua ever explicitly communicated his concerns to his family or to anyone else at the school about the possibility that Marcus might escape consequences. Inspector Morrison checked his notes. Not explicitly, he replied. However, his mother mentioned in an interview that Joshua seemed increasingly angry and hopeless as the investigation progressed. She recalls him saying something to the effect of, "Nothing is going to happen, and everyone is going to pretend it never happened." She interpreted his comments as typical teenage frustration and did not pursue the matter further. Then the 11-day delay between discovery and reporting may itself be significant, Miss Marple observed, returning to her seat. Joshua spent that time researching poisons, not school procedures. He was determining what would be the most effective method to harm Marcus Webb. He merely delayed filing his formal complaint in order to establish an appearance of following proper procedures before taking matters into his own hands. "It's a chilling thought," the inspector admitted. "It suggests premeditation that began immediately upon discovering the grade alterations." Joshua wasn't merely responding in anger to the grading situation. He had already begun planning his revenge before he even reported the incident through proper channels. Miss Marple nodded gravely, which raises an important question about Joshua's understanding of his own actions. Did he fully comprehend the likely consequences of poisoning Marcus with methanol? Or did his research, conducted in haste, and perhaps without proper understanding of chemical interactions, lead him to underestimate the danger? "I've consulted with toxicologists regarding this question," the inspector replied. "The consensus seems to be that adequate internet research regarding methanol would quickly make clear its extreme toxicity. Joshua's claim that he merely intended to cause temporary illness strains credibility. However, there remains the possibility that Joshua, in his emotional distress, chose to minimize the implications of what he was reading, because acknowledging the true danger would have required him to confront the magnitude of what he was planning. A common phenomenon among individuals engaged in morally questionable activities, Miss Marple observed. They engage in what might be described as self-deception, constructing justifications and explanations that allow them to proceed with actions they would never permit themselves to acknowledge if they viewed them with clear-eyed honesty. Joshua may have told himself repeatedly that he merely intended to cause temporary harm, even as he obtained substances and conducted research that clearly demonstrated otherwise. "The investigation will proceed through its proper channels," the inspector said. "Joshua Hartwell will be charged with murder, though his attorney will likely argue for lesser charges based on claims of impulsivity and lack of full understanding regarding the poison's toxicity. The legal system will ultimately determine his culpability. However, I find your perspective on the psychological elements of his actions to be quite illuminating." Inspector Morrison departed shortly thereafter, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts regarding the events that had transpired. She found herself reflecting, as she often did in the aftermath of examining complex human motivations, on the manner in which intelligent individuals could engage in self-deception regarding their own actions. Marcus Webb had convinced himself that the alteration of grades was justified by his desire for achievement. Dr. Sutton had convinced himself that accepting payment for unauthorized access to administrative systems was acceptable because of his financial difficulties, and Joshua Hartwell had convinced himself that poisoning another person was justified because that person had committed an injustice. Each individual, in their own way, had constructed a narrative that permitted them to transgress fundamental ethical principles without acknowledging the full moral implications of their actions. Chapter 5. The Scholarship Scheme Unraveled. As Joshua Hartwell's legal case began its slow progression through the court system, the broader investigation into the grading alterations conducted by Marcus Webb and Dr. Henry Sutton revealed additional victims and additional corruption that extended beyond what had initially been apparent. Inspector Morrison, conducting interviews with the various students whose grades had been altered, discovered a complex pattern of manipulation that suggested Marcus had approached the grading scheme with considerable sophistication and deliberation. Miss Marple found herself invited to the school to meet with Mr. Gerald Thornton and to examine the completed investigation report regarding the full scope of the academic fraud. Accompanied by Mrs. Bantry, who had become genuinely invested in understanding the circumstances surrounding the tragedy, Miss Marple settled herself in Mr. Thornton's office on a grey Thursday morning with a pot of tea and several documents detailing the various grade alterations. "Mr. Thornton," she began, reviewing the report with careful attention, "it appears that Marcus Webb altered the grades of 8 students in total. 4 had their grades lowered, while 4 had their grades raised. I noticed that all 4 of the students whose grades were raised appear to have some sort of documented connection to Marcus Webb." "That is correct," Mr. Thornton confirmed, adjusting his spectacles and regarding the documents with an expression of deep regret. In 3 cases, the students whose grades were raised were close personal friends of Marcus. In the 4th case, the student was a girl named Victoria Ashford, with whom Marcus was apparently romantically involved. All 4 students saw significant increases in their grades over the same period that Joshua Hartwell and the others experienced decreases. "And the scholarships and college acceptances affected by these alterations?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already understood the full scope of the situation. "According to our investigations, Joshua Hartwell lost his State University Science Scholarship, as we discussed. A second student, Margaret Chen, was offered a place in the Mathematics Honours Programme at a prestigious university, but withdrew her application when her grades were changed, believing herself to be unworthy of the programme. She is currently attending a community college. A third student, David Rodriguez, had his acceptance to the architecture program at the State University contingent on maintaining his grade point average. When his grades were lowered, he was able to maintain his overall average by only the narrowest possible margin, but he experienced considerable stress regarding whether he would retain his admission. It represents a cascade of consequences extending far beyond Marcus Webb's immediate manipulation," Miss Marple observed. "Each alteration affected not merely a grade, but the entire future trajectory of another person's life. College acceptances, scholarship opportunities, career pathways, all were altered by Marcus's actions." Mrs. Bantry set down her teacup with a sharp clink. "But surely Marcus understood what he was doing. He must have known that altering grades would have real consequences for other students." "I believe Marcus did understand," Miss Marple replied carefully, "though I suspect he chose not to fully acknowledge the implications of his actions. He may have told himself that the students whose grades he lowered would still attend college, albeit at less prestigious institutions. He may have convinced himself that his own achievements justified whatever minor harm might result to others. This is a common failing among individuals of above-average intelligence and privilege. They sometimes develop a sense that the normal ethical rules do not apply to them because they are sufficiently intelligent or capable to justify their own actions to themselves." Mr. Thornton extracted another document from the file. "What troubles me most," he said heavily, "is that Marcus was genuinely a talented young man. His intelligence was not merely apparent in his academic performance, but evident in every conversation one had with him. He had genuine potential to accomplish remarkable things. Instead, he chose to abuse his talents and his position in service of his own ambitions. A recurring tragedy of human nature," Miss Marple observed. "One sees it repeatedly in village life. The person with genuine capability, who who might have used their abilities to improve the world around them, instead chooses to employ those abilities in service of their own narrow interests. And the tragedy becomes multiplied when the actions of such individuals affect others. Joshua Hartwell, for all his anger and desperation, would likely have pursued legitimate pathways to education and success if Marcus Webb had not altered his grades. Dr. Sutton, for all his poor financial decisions, was not inherently a corrupt man, and the students whose academic records were falsified now must navigate their futures knowing that their perceived achievements were not entirely their own. Dr. Sutton has been removed from his position, of course, Mr. Thornton continued. He faces criminal charges related to the unauthorized access to the computer system, though the prosecutor has indicated that he is willing to accept a plea agreement that may result in reduced charges if Dr. Sutton testifies regarding Marcus's role in orchestrating the scheme. Dr. Sutton's cooperation has been quite complete. He provided documentation of all communications with Marcus, including financial records showing the payments Marcus made in exchange for the grade alterations. How did Marcus fund these payments? Miss, Marple asked. A high school student would presumably not have significant financial resources. That is where the investigation becomes even more troubling, Mr. Thornton replied. Marcus obtained the money through a combination of sources. His family is quite wealthy, and his parents provided him with a generous allowance. However, that alone would not have been sufficient. Marcus supplemented his income by selling copies of previous examinations to other students who were preparing for tests. He also provided tutoring services at premium rates, telling students and parents that his demonstrated academic excellence qualified him to provide superior instruction. In actuality, some of the students he tutored were students whose grades he intended to lower, and the tutoring he provided deliberately focused on material that would not appear on the actual examinations. An elaborate scheme of multiple frauds, layered one upon the other, Miss Marple observed. Each deception supported the others, creating a complex structure that might have remained undetected indefinitely if Joshua Hartwell had not become so angry about the grade alterations. Mr. Thornton closed the investigation file with a gesture that seemed to contain both resignation and relief. The Board of Trustees has asked me to oversee the implementation of new security protocols for the computer system. We will be installing additional safeguards, requiring administrative access to be shared among multiple individuals rather than entrusting it to a single person, and implementing a system whereby all grade alterations are reviewed and approved by at least 2 individuals before they are implemented in the permanent record. We will also be conducting a more thorough audit of the academic records of previous years to determine whether similar fraud may have occurred prior to the discovery of Marcus's activities. Necessary measures, Miss Marple agreed, though I imagine some students and parents will be quite distressed if the investigation reveals that grades have been manipulated in previous years. There are few things that damage a community more thoroughly than the discovery that the institutions meant to serve that community have been compromised. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry prepared to depart from the school, Mr. Thornton walked them to the gymnasium, which was now being prepared for use once again following the poisoning incident. Workers were repainting the walls and replacing the damaged punch bowl and serving equipment. The room had been cleared of its decorative streamers and banners, and it now appeared as it normally did, a simple athletic facility waiting to be filled with some new celebration or purpose. It's remarkable how quickly physical spaces can be restored to their appearance, Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Bantry as they departed. Yet the damage done to this community's trust and sense of security will require considerably more time to repair. The families of these students will never again view their academic institution with quite the same assumption of integrity, and the students themselves will carry forward into their adult lives the knowledge that those entrusted with authority over them betrayed that trust. Chapter 6. Motive and Method Dissected. The trial of Joshua Hartwell began in late August, more than 3 months after the graduation ceremony that had resulted in Marcus Webb's death. The courthouse was crowded on the opening day, with local reporters, school officials, and community members eager to understand how the case would be prosecuted and what legal arguments would be presented regarding Joshua's culpability. Inspector Morrison, having completed his investigation, attended the proceedings in an official capacity, and arranged for Miss Marple to be seated with himself and Sergeant Patricia Williams. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. The Assistant District Attorney, a competent woman named Sarah Mitchell, presented the evidence regarding Joshua's research into poisons, his purchase of methanol, his removal of the ladle from the punch bowl, and his documented observation near the refreshment table during the poisoning. The timeline was presented with crystal clarity, demonstrating that Joshua had time and opportunity to contaminate the punch. Most damning of all were Joshua's own statements to Inspector Morrison, which had been recorded and which clearly demonstrated his knowledge regarding the toxicity of methanol and his deliberate intention to harm Marcus Webb. Joshua's attorney, a man named Thomas Richards, who had been assigned to defend the young man, pursued a somewhat different strategy. Rather than arguing that Joshua was innocent, Richards focused on presenting evidence of Joshua's emotional state at the time of his actions. He called expert witnesses to testify regarding the psychological effects of trauma and injustice on adolescent development. He presented testimony from Joshua's teachers and parents regarding his previously good character and his lack of any previous involvement with criminal activity. And he emphasized repeatedly that Joshua had not fully appreciated the lethality of his actions, claiming that the young man had been in a state of emotional distress that impaired his judgment and his ability to understand the full consequences of what he was doing. During the trial's second week, Joshua himself took the stand in his own defense, a risky strategy that his attorney apparently felt was necessary to demonstrate his client's remorse and his lack of intentional murderous intent. Joshua's testimony was halting and emotional. He described his initial discovery of the grade alterations and his gradual realization that Marcus was responsible. He acknowledged his research into poisons and his decision to obtain methanol, but he maintained that he had not intended to kill Marcus. "I just wanted him to suffer like I was suffering," Joshua testified, his voice breaking with emotion. "I wanted him to be sick, to miss his college classes, to have consequences for what he did to me. I wasn't thinking about death. I was angry and I was desperate and I made bad choices. But I didn't want to kill him." Under cross-examination by the prosecution, Joshua's claims began to unravel. The Assistant District Attorney presented evidence of the research he had conducted regarding methanol's toxicity. She introduced printouts from websites that Joshua had visited, all of which contained clear warnings about methanol's danger and its potential to cause permanent organ damage or death. She presented testimony from a toxicologist regarding the amount of methanol that would be required to cause the symptoms Marcus experienced, and asked Joshua directly whether he believed that amount would have been sufficient to cause serious harm or death. Joshua's answers became increasingly evasive. He claimed that he had not read certain passages carefully. He suggested that he had not understood the technical information he was reviewing. He indicated that he had been in an emotionally distressed state that prevented him from fully absorbing the information he encountered. Each answer further damaged his credibility in the eyes of the jury. It was during a recess in the trial that Inspector Morrison approached Miss Marple with a question that had apparently been troubling him. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I wonder whether you might offer your perspective on Joshua's testimony. Do you believe he was being truthful when he claimed that he did not intend Marcus's death, or was he simply providing testimony that his attorney had coached him to present?" Miss Marple considered the question with her characteristic care, watching through the courthouse windows as Joshua stood outside with his parents, the young man's face bearing the expression of someone confronting the magnitude of consequences he had set in motion. "I believe," she replied slowly, "that Joshua's emotional state at the time of his actions was complex and contradictory. He was simultaneously engaged in self-deception regarding his intentions, while simultaneously aware, at some level, of the danger he was creating. The human mind is capable of maintaining two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, Inspector. Joshua may well have convinced himself that he only intended temporary harm while simultaneously conducting research that would have made clear to him the possibility or even likelihood of death." "Then you believe he is culpable for murder?" the inspector asked. "I believe he is culpable for placing a lethal poison in a beverage consumed by another human being," Miss Marple replied. "Whether his mental state at the time constitutes the legal definition of murder is a matter for the jury and the legal system to determine. However, I do not believe that emotional distress entirely absolves one of responsibility for one's actions, even if it may mitigate the degree of that culpability. The jury's deliberations lasted 4 days. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman was asked to announce their verdict on the charge of murder in the first degree. The jury had found Joshua Hartwell guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that seemed to represent a compromise between the prosecution's claim of intentional murder and the defense's argument for reduced culpability based on emotional distress. Joshua received a sentence of 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years. As the verdict was announced, Joshua collapsed in tears at the defense table, his parents' faces bearing expressions of anguish and resignation. The courtroom descended into the quiet murmur of people processing a conclusion that satisfied no one entirely. The prosecution believed the sentence was too lenient for what they viewed as a clear case of premeditated murder. The defense believed the verdict was too harsh for a young man whose actions, while wrong, had stemmed from legitimate grievance and emotional distress rather than cold-blooded murderous intent. And Miss Marple, observing the scene with her characteristic gravity, reflected on the manner in which the legal system attempted to impose order on the chaos of human emotion and motivation. Chapter 7. The Superintendent's Silence. In the weeks following Joshua Hartwell's conviction, attention within the St. Cuthbert's community gradually shifted away from the immediate circumstances of Marcus Webb's death and began to focus more intently on the broader question of how such extensive academic fraud could have occurred without earlier detection. Questions began to be raised regarding the superintendent of schools, Dr. Eleanor Castellanos, and her supervision of the various high school administrators. If Dr. Sutton had been engaged in selling access to the grading system for payment, surely some of the school district supervisory personnel should have detected such irregular activities. Inspector Morrison, continuing to pursue the broader implications of the case, found himself requesting additional meetings with Miss Marple to discuss various aspects of the administrative oversight that had proven so inadequate. One such meeting occurred at Miss Marple's residence on a cool September afternoon, with the inspector arriving bearing several documents related to the school district's administrative procedures. Miss Marple, the inspector began without preamble, I find myself confronted with an uncomfortable question regarding the school district's administration. Dr. Sutton's financial situation had been deteriorating for several years. He had taken out multiple loans, sold assets, and engaged in various financial transactions that should have been visible to anyone monitoring his activities. Additionally, his purchase of expensive equipment and his apparent increases in personal spending should have attracted some notice. Yet no one in the district administration seems to have been aware of these circumstances or concerned about Dr. Sutton's financial difficulties. This raises the question of whether the district administration conducted any meaningful supervision of its personnel, Miss Marple observed. Tell me, Inspector, what was Dr. Castellanos' relationship with Dr. Sutton? Had they worked together for an extended period? They had worked together for approximately 12 years, the inspector replied, consulting his notes. Dr. Castellanos had promoted Dr. Sutton from a teacher position to his administrative role, and they apparently had a cordial professional relationship. However, when I questioned Dr. Castellanos about her knowledge of Dr. Sutton's financial difficulties, she claimed to have no awareness of any such problems. But surely she must have observed something unusual in his behaviour, or his circumstances, Mrs. Bantry asked, having accompanied Miss Marple for the discussion. That is precisely what troubles me, the inspector admitted. Dr. Castellanos was asked whether she had noticed any changes in Dr. Sutton's demeanour, whether he appeared stressed or anxious, whether he had mentioned any personal difficulties. To all of these questions she responded that she had noticed nothing unusual. Yet the interviews I conducted with other administrative personnel revealed that Dr. Sutton had been noticeably tense and anxious during the period when he was accepting payments from Marcus Webb. Multiple people mentioned that he seemed distracted, that he made unusual requests for privacy regarding certain administrative matters, and that he appeared to have become increasingly isolated from his colleagues. Either Dr. Castellanos is remarkably unobservant or she chose not to observe, Miss Marple said quietly. Which possibility do you find more likely? I'm beginning to suspect the latter, the inspector replied. I've reviewed Dr. Castellanos's administrative records and found something quite interesting. Approximately 18 months ago, Dr. Sutton authorized a payment from discretionary administrative funds to a consulting firm that appears to exist primarily on paper. The consulting firm's address is a postal box in another state, and the firm's owner cannot be located. When I questioned Dr. Castellanos about this payment, she initially claimed to have no knowledge of it, but when I presented her with documentation showing that she herself had approved the payment, she suddenly remembered that Dr. Sutton had requested her approval for what he claimed was a legitimate educational consulting service. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a soft clink. You suspect that Dr. Castellanos approved fraudulent payments in order to avoid acknowledging awareness of financial irregularities, she said slowly. Perhaps she sensed that something improper was occurring but chose not to investigate too closely, thereby maintaining plausible deniability regarding knowledge of wrongdoing. That is my growing suspicion, the inspector confirmed. I've obtained subpoenas for Dr. Castellanos's personal financial records, and I've discovered that she received a payment of $5,000 from the same consulting firm that had received the fraudulent payment from the school district. It appears that Dr. Castellanos may have been complicit in the scheme to some degree. But how can you prove such complicity? Miss Marple inquired. If Dr. Castellanos approved the payment in her official capacity, and if the consulting firm was apparently legitimate on its face, she might claim that she was simply performing her administrative duties without knowledge of any fraud. That is the difficulty, the inspector acknowledged. Proving that Dr. Castellanos knew the consulting firm was fraudulent and intentionally approved payment to it would require demonstrating that she had knowledge of facts that she could reasonably claim to have been unaware of. However, I've discovered additional evidence that may prove more conclusive. The phone records for the consulting firm's postal box show that the box was accessed from Dr. Castellanos's personal cell phone number on several occasions. In other words, Dr. Castellanos used the postal box herself, which would indicate direct knowledge of the operation. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, her hands clasped before her, as she contemplated the implications of this revelation. Dr. Castellanos appears to have been engaged in her own form of financial impropriety, separate from Dr. Sutton's corruption but facilitated by it. She needed financial resources beyond her superintendent's salary, and she was willing to create a fraudulent consulting firm and direct district funds to it in order to obtain those resources. However, such activities would have required Dr. Sutton's cooperation, which he provided in exchange for her willingness to overlook the financial irregularities that were occurring under her supervision. A mutually beneficial arrangement of corruption, the inspector said grimly. Dr. Sutton gained access to capital to pay his creditors and to facilitate his arrangement with Marcus Webb. Dr. Castellanos gained supplementary income through what she could characterize as legitimate consulting services. Neither had to directly acknowledge awareness of the other's wrongdoing, and both benefited from the arrangement. And in the process, they created an environment in which Marcus Webb felt entitled to abuse his position for his own benefit, Miss Marple concluded. When those in authority demonstrate that they are willing to engage in financial impropriety, it sends a message to those under their supervision that ethical standards are flexible and subject to personal interpretation. Dr. Castellanos's corruption, even if motivated by financial difficulty, undermined the institutional integrity that the school system was meant to represent. Inspector Morrison departed a short while later, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the broadening scope of the wrongdoing that the graduation party poisoning had uncovered. What had appeared initially to be a simple case of a vengeful student poisoning a rival had gradually revealed itself to be a symptom of much deeper corruption within the school's administrative structure. The poisoning itself, terrible as it was, paled in comparison to the systemic betrayal of trust that had been revealed through the investigation. Chapter 8. The Weight of Consequences. The criminal investigation that had begun with Marcus Webb's death at the graduation party ultimately resulted in charges against not only Joshua Hartwell, but also Dr. Henry Sutton, and, more surprisingly, Dr. Eleanor Castellanos. Dr. Sutton accepted a plea agreement and received a sentence of 5 years imprisonment, with part of his sentence suspended due to his cooperation in a revealing the extent of the grading fraud and the connections to Dr. Castellanos. Dr. Castellanos faced more serious charges of embezzlement and fraud, and eventually accepted a plea agreement that resulted in her resignation from her position and a sentence of 3 years imprisonment. As the legal proceedings reached their conclusions in late fall, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the various victims of these crimes and the manner in which the consequences of the wrongdoing extended far beyond those who had been directly charged with criminal activities. She accepted an invitation to meet with Margaret Chen, one of the students whose grades had been artificially lowered by Marcus Webb, and who had consequently withdrawn her application from the Mathematics Honours programme. Margaret arrived at Miss Marple's residence on a grey November afternoon, a slender young woman of perhaps 18 with intelligent eyes that bore the weight of experience beyond her years. She had enrolled at the local community college in the fall, a choice that seemed to represent a compromise between her ambitions and her current circumstances. Over tea, Margaret shared her reflections on the impact that the grade manipulation had exerted on her life planning. "I had worked so hard," Margaret explained, her voice carrying an undertone of resignation. "I wanted to study mathematics at a prestigious university. I had the ability to do so. I was certain of that. But when my grades were changed, I didn't have the confidence to believe in myself anymore. I thought, if my grades show that I'm not as capable as I believed, then maybe I'm not actually ready for a competitive program. So I applied to the community college instead, thinking I would transfer later after proving myself. But now I'm wondering if I'll ever have the courage to attempt that transfer." "That is the insidious damage that such deception inflicts," Miss Marple observed quietly. "It not merely affects grades or college, acceptances. It damages the victim's sense of their own capabilities and their belief in their ability to accomplish their goals. You have been taught, through the actions of Marcus Webb and Dr. Sutton, that the world is not necessarily a fair or meritocratic place, that your achievements might be subject to manipulation by those in authority, and that you cannot entirely trust the systems meant to evaluate and reward your efforts." Margaret nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes as she acknowledged the accuracy of Miss Marple's assessment. "Will it be better when I transfer?" she asked quietly. "Will I ever feel confident again that my grades actually reflect my abilities?" "I believe you must work to restore your confidence through direct engagement with your own learning," Miss Marple replied. "You know, in your own mind, what you are capable of. Trust that knowledge. Learn to evaluate your own abilities based on your understanding of the material you study and your ability to apply that knowledge in novel situations. Do not allow the violation of trust that others have perpetrated to extend to a violation of trust in yourself." Miss Marple's conversation with Margaret Chen was followed by additional meetings with other students affected by the grading fraud. Each carried forward some version of the sense of betrayal and lost confidence that Margaret had expressed. Joshua Hartwell's conviction and incarceration represented legal justice, but it did not restore what had been taken from these students. The simple sense that the institutions meant to serve them could be trusted to operate with integrity. By November, the St. Cuthbert's community had reached a point where attention to the immediate circumstances of the poisoning and the subsequent investigations had begun to fade from public consciousness. The school had implemented its new security protocols. The Board of Trustees had appointed a new superintendent of schools, and the various students and faculty, members affected by the events, had begun the difficult work of moving forward with their lives. Inspector Morrison paid a final visit to Miss Marple in mid-November, bringing with him the completed investigation files and expressing his gratitude for her insights throughout the process. He was preparing for his retirement from active police work, and he seemed inclined to reflect on the manner in which the case had unfolded. "I confess, Miss Marple," he said, with a note of resignation, "that I entered this investigation expecting to discover a straightforward case of a vengeful student poisoning a rival. Instead, I discovered layers upon layers of deception, corruption, and ethical failure that extended throughout the entire institution. I wonder, in retrospect, whether I should have suspected such depth of wrongdoing from the beginning. You pursued the investigation precisely as it needed to be pursued, Inspector, Miss Marple assured him. You followed the evidence wherever it led. The difficulty was simply that the evidence led to places that no one wished to acknowledge. It is always easier to accept a simple explanation for a tragic event than to acknowledge that the tragedy may have resulted from the failure of multiple individuals and systems to maintain ethical standards. As Inspector Morrison departed, Miss Marple stood at her window, regarding the peaceful village street beyond. The autumn had been beautiful that year, with the trees displaying brilliant displays of colour before the inevitable transition to winter. And yet beneath that beauty, she knew, existed the same complexities of human nature that had been revealed so painfully at St. Cuthbert's High School. The capacity for deception, the willingness to prioritise personal benefit over ethical responsibility, and the manner in which wrongdoing in one area created the conditions for wrongdoing in other areas. These were aspects of human nature that were, Miss Marple had learned, fundamentally unchanging. Chapter 9. An Autumn Reckoning. As December approached, bringing with it the various holiday celebrations and the sense of a year drawing toward closure, Miss Marple was approached by Mr. Gerald Thornton with a request that she attend a special assembly at St. Cuthbert's High School. The school, he explained in a formal letter, wished to honour those individuals who had contributed to the investigation of the crimes that had occurred, and he believed that Miss Marple's participation in recognising the community's response to the tragedy would be meaningful. Miss Marple accepted the invitation with the expectation that the assembly would provide an opportunity for the school community to reflect on the events of the past months and to acknowledge the importance of maintaining ethical standards. Accompanied by Mrs. Bantry, she arrived at the school gymnasium on a cold December morning and was escorted to a seat near the stage where Mr. Thornton and several members of the school board awaited her. The assembly proceeded with the formality appropriate to such occasions. Mr. Thornton spoke of the school's commitment to maintaining academic integrity and of the measures that had been implemented to prevent future fraud. Inspector Morrison was invited to make brief remarks regarding the importance of community cooperation in pursuing justice. Several teachers and administrators spoke about the importance of mentoring students and providing them with ethical guidance. And finally, Mr. Thornton extended an invitation for Miss Marple to address the assembled students and faculty. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and made her way to the microphone, aware that the gymnasium had fallen silent in anticipation of her remarks. She paused for a moment, organising her thoughts, before beginning to speak. "Young people and members of this school community," she said quietly, but with a clarity that carried throughout the gymnasium, "I have been asked to speak to you today about the events that have occurred in this school over the past several months. I suspect some of you may hope that I will offer a simple explanation or a simple moral lesson about what has transpired. I am afraid I cannot do so." She paused, allowing her gaze to move across the faces assembled before her. "Instead, I can only offer the observations that I have accumulated throughout my many years of observing human nature. I've learned that individuals, even those with genuine talents and capabilities, sometimes allow themselves to be seduced by the allure of achievement, without the hard work that genuine achievement requires. I have learned that those in positions of authority sometimes allow personal financial difficulty or personal dissatisfaction to compromise their ethical standards, and I have learned that when wrongdoing occurs at any level within an institution, it creates the conditions for wrongdoing to occur at other levels as well. The poisoning of Marcus Webb with methanol was a terrible tragedy that should never have occurred. The young man's death was a loss, not only to his family but to society, which lost the potential contributions that he might have made had he chosen to employ his talents in ethical service rather than in pursuit of personal advantage. However, the poisoning itself was merely the most visible manifestation of a deeper crisis of integrity that had afflicted this school's administration and, to some degree, had infected the broader culture of this institution. Miss Marple's voice grew stronger as she continued, and several students in the audience sat forward with increased attention. We often speak of the importance of following rules and respecting authority. These are legitimate values, but they must be balanced against a deeper commitment to fundamental ethical principles. When those in authority betray your trust, as has occurred in this institution, you are faced with a choice. You may conclude that ethical standards are merely social conventions to be followed or ignored as personal benefit dictates. Or you may conclude that integrity is a fundamental value that you must maintain regardless of the example set by those around you. Joshua Hartwell was confronted with circumstances that were genuinely unjust. He had worked hard in his studies, and his academic record had been falsely diminished through the dishonest actions of someone in authority. His response to this injustice was to engage in his own act of terrible dishonesty. He allowed anger and the desire for revenge to override his better judgment, and in doing so, he ensured that he became trapped by the very circumstances that had initially victimized him. This is the tragedy that I wish you, as young people, to truly understand. When you encounter injustice, you have legitimate cause for anger, but that anger, if allowed to control your actions, will lead you away from justice and toward additional wrongdoing. The proper response to betrayal of trust is not to betray trust in return, but rather to recommit yourself to the maintenance of ethical standards, even when doing so requires suffering and sacrifice. Miss Marple looked out across the gymnasium, noting the expressions of quiet reflection on many of the young faces before her. She spoke for several minutes more, emphasizing the importance of personal integrity, the necessity of maintaining ethical standards in the face of pressure and temptation, and the manner in which individual actions ripple outward to affect others in ways that we cannot always predict or control. When she returned to her seat, the gymnasium remained silent for several long moments before Mr. Thornton rose to offer concluding remarks and to bring the assembly to conclusion. As the students filed out of the gymnasium, several approached Miss Marple to thank her for her remarks, and she received their gratitude with the gentle grace that had always characterized her. Interactions with Young People. Chapter 10. Resolution and Reflection. The winter that followed the assembly at St. Cuthbert's High School was unremarkable in most respects, proceeding with the ordinary progression of seasons and the quiet rhythms of village life in St. Mary Mead. Yet for Miss Marple, the events surrounding Marcus Webb's death and the subsequent investigations had prompted her to reflect deeply on the nature of justice, the complexities of human motivation, and the manner in which institutional corruption could extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of any single crime. By early spring of the following year, the final legal proceedings related to the poisoning case had concluded. Joshua Hartwell was serving his sentence in the state penitentiary, where he had apparently engaged in educational activities and had begun working toward earning his high school diploma through a correspondence program. Dr. Henry Sutton was also imprisoned, serving out the remainder of his sentence, his career and reputation entirely destroyed. Dr. Eleanor Castellanos had been released from custody after serving 18 months of her 3-year sentence and had relocated to another state, her position as superintendent permanently forfeited and her professional reputation irreparably damaged. Marcus Webb's parents had established a scholarship fund in their son's name, a gesture that appeared to represent their attempt to transform the tragedy of his death into something that might benefit other students. The irony that Marcus had engaged in behavior that had prevented other students from attending university was not lost on Miss Marple, though she held her observation in silence, respecting the parents' grief and their attempt to create meaning from loss. It was on a clear April morning that Inspector Morrison paid his final visit to Miss Marple's residence before his official retirement from the police force. He appeared older than he had during the investigation, as though the process of unravelling the various layers of corruption had extracted an emotional toll. Yet his expression seemed lighter, as though the burden of active duty was soon to be lifted. "Miss Marple, I have come to bid you farewell before I depart from my position," he said, settling himself in the familiar chair where he had sat so many times during the investigation. "I leave with gratitude for your insights and your patience in helping me understand the complexities of this case. I leave also with a sense of deep concern about the broader state of institutional integrity in our society. If corruption of the magnitude we discovered can occur in a high school administrative structure, what does that suggest about the integrity of larger institutions?" Miss Marple poured tea for both of them with her customary care before responding. "Your concern is not unfounded, Inspector. I have spent a lifetime observing human nature in the village of St. Mary Mead, and I have learned that the same weaknesses that manifest themselves in small communities appear in larger institutions as well. People are people, regardless of the scale on which they operate. The temptations to prioritize personal benefit over ethical responsibility, to justify questionable actions through convenient rationalizations, and to overlook wrongdoing when acknowledging it would require difficult action, these are weaknesses that appear consistently throughout human society. Then is there any hope for improvement? The inspector asked, somewhat despondently. I believe there is, Miss Marple replied, though the hope lies not in expecting individuals to be fundamentally different, but rather in creating systems and cultivating values that make it more difficult for corruption to flourish. When institutions implement meaningful oversight, when they resist the temptation to trust entirely in the good intentions of individuals in authority, when they prioritize transparency and accountability, then the opportunities for wrongdoing diminish. Additionally, I believe that young people must be educated not merely in their academic subjects, but in the importance of ethical integrity. Joshua Hartwell was intelligent and capable, but he was not adequately educated in the proper manner of responding to injustice. Marcus Webb possessed genuine talents, but lacked the ethical guidance necessary to direct those talents toward constructive purposes. The inspector nodded slowly as though absorbing the wisdom of Miss Marple's assessment. As I prepare to leave active service, I find myself hoping that the younger generation of law enforcement officers will approach their work with the understanding that justice is not merely about identifying wrongdoing and pursuing conviction, but about understanding the complex circumstances and human motivations that lead individuals toward crime. Your perspective throughout this investigation has helped me understand that criminals are not simply malevolent beings engaged in evil for its own sake, but rather people who have allowed themselves to be seduced by various temptations and who have rationalized their actions in ways that permit them to proceed without acknowledging the full moral implications of what they are doing. Inspector Morrison departed shortly thereafter, and Miss Marple received word some weeks later that he had officially concluded his service with the police force. She hoped that his retirement would bring him a measure of peace, and that his many years of dedicated service to justice would be followed by years of relative tranquility. As spring progressed towards summer, Miss Marple found herself thinking with increasing frequency about the various individuals who had been affected by the poisoning and the subsequent investigations. She wondered how Joshua Hartwell was adjusting to his incarceration and whether his work toward obtaining his high school diploma was proceeding successfully. She thought of Margaret Chen and hoped that the young woman's education at the community college was helping to restore her confidence in her academic abilities. She reflected on Marcus Webb's parents and the manner in which they were attempting to honor their son's memory through the scholarship fund, though she suspected that their grief would not diminish substantially with the passage of time. Most of all, she contemplated the manner in which a single event, the poisoning of punch at a graduation celebration, had unraveled to reveal deep currents of corruption, ambition, and ethical failure within what had appeared to be a stable and trustworthy institution. The case had reminded her of something that she had learned many times throughout her years in St. Mary Mead. Evil and wrongdoing do not typically announce themselves through obvious signs or dramatic confrontations. Rather, they seep gradually into communities and institutions, often unnoticed by those who might have the authority and responsibility to address them. It requires careful observation, a willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, and a commitment to pursuing justice even when doing so is difficult and inconvenient. As she sat in her garden one warm June afternoon, watching the flowers bloom and the birds engage in their summer activities, Miss Marple reflected that the events of the past year had not fundamentally altered her understanding of human nature. They had merely confirmed what she'd known for many years. People possessed the capacity for both remarkable goodness and remarkable wrongdoing. They could be intelligent and foolish, kind and cruel, honest and deceitful, often within the same individual. The key to understanding and preventing wrongdoing lay not in developing naive faith in human nature, but rather in maintaining a realistic assessment of human weakness, while still believing in the possibility of change and redemption. The case of Marcus Webb's death, Joshua. Hartwell's conviction and the exposure of corruption within St. Cuthbert's administration had concluded, but its lessons would remain with Miss Marple, reinforcing the observations and understanding that had guided her through a lifetime of encountering human nature in all its complexity. And she knew that other mysteries, other crimes, and other instances of wrongdoing would eventually come to her attention. She was content to address them as she always had, with careful observation, gentle inquiry, and unwavering commitment to the truth, regardless of where that truth might lead, or what uncomfortable revelations it might entail. The end of Velvet Clue's original mystery. This concludes our tale, dear listeners. I do hope you've enjoyed this mystery and the tradition of Miss Marple, narrated here for Velvet Clues. We've seen how a single act of poisoning revealed layers of corruption, ambition, and the terrible consequences of allowing ethics to take a backseat to personal gain. As Miss Marple has shown us, the truth is rarely simple, and justice is never straightforward. Thank you for joining me, Connor, in this journey through deception and human nature. May we all endeavour, in our own lives, to maintain the integrity that Miss Marple herself exemplifies. Until next time, do take care of yourselves, and remember, in matters of mystery and morality, careful observation is your most valuable tool. Good night.